Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. After the end of World War II, numerous territories that were held by the defeated Axis powers were divided up and occupied by the victorious Allies, most notably in Germany, Austria, and Korea. However, one notable exception was Japan, who, despite facing potential invasion from both the US and Soviet Union, would end up coming under complete US occupation. So, why weren't they divided like the rest of the Axis? And what if, in an alternate timeline, Japan was divided after World War II? So, first, why wasn't Japan divided up amongst the Allies when numerous other places were? Well, the answer is actually extremely simple. A. Communism, and B. Diplomatic leverage. Let me explain. By the end of World War II, relations between the Soviet Union and the West were rapidly deteriorating as the two sides found themselves competing for influence on the world stage, and the West took it upon themselves to try to contain Soviet and communist expansion across the world. And though they couldn't really do all that much about the territory the Soviets were already occupying, most notably in Eastern Europe, the West could do their best to stop the Soviets from going any further. And so, with this in mind, the US pushed to defeat Japan as quickly as possible in order to prevent a potential Soviet expansion into Japan. However, the problem was Japan itself. The Japanese saw surrender as the highest form of dishonor that anyone could commit, which, to be honest, understandable. But this meant that it was going to be extremely difficult to force Japan to surrender, short of a full-scale invasion of the home islands. And that was going to be brutal. But, as luck would have it, by July of 1945, the US would complete the creation of the first nuclear weapons, which had the potential to cause enough destruction to force Japan to surrender, avoiding a brutal invasion and potential Soviet invasion. And so, the US sent an ultimatum to Japan in the Potsdam Declaration, demanding unconditional surrender or destruction the likes of which has never been seen on the Earth. The Japanese promptly ignored them. And so, on August 6th, the US dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, telling the Japanese that there was more where that came from. And a couple days later, on August 9th, the Soviets would launch an invasion of Manchuria, making it as far down as the northern portions of Korea, followed a few hours later by another bombing in Nagasaki. Now, the Japanese were freaked out by the bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they feared a Soviet occupation much more than an American occupation, for the simple reason of how communism and authoritarian monarchies haven't had the best track record with each other. And so, on August 15th, 1945, before the Soviets even had the chance to invade, and fearing further American bombings, like on, say, Tokyo for instance, the Japanese officially surrendered as the country came under American occupation and World War II finally came to a conclusive end. But, unlike the Soviets, plenty of people right now have the chance to invade your privacy, as without proper protection, your data could easily get stolen on the internet by hackers, scammers, and other bad actors. But that's why I'm glad that today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Now, I'm sure you've already seen plenty of VPNs on the market that say they'll protect you from all sorts of threats, and maybe you're even using one right now. But none of them are able to match the same level of quality that NordVPN provides. Apart from being the largest, most trusted, and fastest VPN out there, NordVPN employs the most cutting-edge technology specifically designed to keep you safe from any sorts of attacks. Whereas most other VPNs just use simple DNS filtering, NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro automatically scans any file you download and any link you click, as well as blocking any pop-up while browsing. And not only that, NordVPN also offers a 30-day money-back guarantee to make sure your purchase is truly risk-free. So make sure to head on down to nordvpn.com/SullivanHistory for their exclusive deal, and as always, you'll be supporting my channel. And now, back to the video. So, After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviets approaching ever closer to their doorstep, the Japanese decided to finally surrender, being occupied fully by the United States. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Japan was invaded and divided? So, as I'm sure most of you already know, the US already had plans for a potential invasion of Japan, just in case things ended up going wrong and Japan didn't end up surrendering. So, all that we'd need to change is just keep Japan from surrendering, and the best way to do that would be just to delay the completion of the atomic bomb so America can't force Japan into submission. And even though the Japanese would be fearful of a potential Soviet invasion, we're gonna assume, for the sake of the scenario, that despite this threat, Japan still refuses to surrender and the war goes on. So, with the war with Japan dragging on, the US would be forced to enact its planned invasion, Operation Downfall. Operation Downfall was split up into two separate operations, the first being Operation Olympic, which would see American troops launch an amphibious invasion of the island of Kyushu on a scheduled X day. And funny enough, given that it was an invasion of Japan, every single landing beach were all named after different car brands. And then, if the Japanese still didn't surrender, the US would then launch the second operation, being Operation Coronet, which would see a full-scale US invasion of Tokyo and the rest of the Kanto Plain. The Japanese did have plans to counter Downfall, Operation Ketsugo, but these plans weren't so much to defeat the invasion as much as to just slow it down. Meanwhile, with the extra time given by a Japanese refusal to surrender, the Soviets would complete their invasion of Korea and launch their planned invasion of the Japanese island of Hokkaido, as Japan would be invaded on two sides by the US and the Soviets. And so, likely by early 1946, after such a brutal invasion, Japan would be forced to surrender as their territory is divided between Soviet and American occupation zones, which would end up forming their own governments of North and South Japan. Now, since the Soviets would have taken all of Korea, this means that Korea is never divided between North and South, and so the communist regime of Kim Il-sung would take complete control of the peninsula as the Korean War never ends up happening. But Japan is a different story. With the country divided between North and South, both regimes would seek reunification under their own rule. However, unlike Korea, Japan would have just faced severe destruction after being invaded by the Americans and Soviets, and so likely wouldn't want to start another war to risk even more destruction, as both sides would see potential for them to be completely obliterated. North Japan, seeing South Japan's clear superiority in terms of population, industrialization, and development, would likely worry that they would be quickly crushed by the South. And South Japan, possibly worried about a potential Soviet and Chinese invasion from Korea, would also not want to start a war. And even in our own timeline, Japan had voluntarily disarmed themselves to keep from starting any future wars. So, as a result, Japan would likely remain divided throughout the duration of the Cold War, much like Korea had in our own timeline, and possibly even up to the present day. Now, after the end of the Cold War, again, much like North Korea, North Japan would fall firmly in the Chinese sphere of influence. And with China having complete domination over the entirety of Korea, as well as the northern half of Japan, this would greatly strengthen China's position in the Asia-Pacific. And as time goes on, Japan remains divided, split between its communist northern regime and capitalist south. But will Japan ever be able to reunify? As time moves forward, the answer to that question remains a mystery. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also, maybe, subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.